In this episode, we talk about a man who allegedly killed his entire immediate family for the payout from their insurance policies and why this may not be an isolated incident. We also talk about a rare moment of optimism in a 2-year conflict as Israel and Hamas begin a fragile truce under a deal brokered by President Trump. But we begin today by talking about the Indian economy and why many experts are surprised by the fact that it appears to be doing well. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to 3 Things, the Indian Express news show. For months now, official data has suggested that Indian economy is doing well. Unlike many other countries, India's real GDP growth numbers have been on the rise. For instance, in the first quarter of this year, the GDP growth rate stood at 7.8%, which is a pretty good sign. But for those who track these numbers closely, something doesn't quite add up. Because even though the data paints a positive picture, the government's recent policy moves, from tax reliefs to targeted welfare schemes, seem to signal economic stress, as if people really need more support right now. So how can the economy be doing well on paper and yet the government's action reflect distress? To unpack this puzzle, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Udit Misra, who writes on the economy for the paper.
Okay, Udit, first tell us, based on what is known as real GDP, how well is India's economy doing? And tell us, why do you and why do others find that surprising?
Yeah, so, real GDP is looked at as the key variable when you're talking about economic growth anywhere in the world. And first of all, let's just understand what is real GDP. Real GDP is a derived number. It's not something that you actually go out and, observe on the ground. What you observe on the ground is nominal GDP, right? It's the market price total value of all goods and services in the country. Then you take away the effect of inflation from it to understand the real GDP. How many more trucks did you sell? How many more spoons did India make? Instead of just looking at total valuation of it, because total valuation gets affected by prices. Now, in terms of real GDP, India's economy has been surprising on the upside. Many of our listeners might recall, we've had these conversations that every quarter we find that India's real GDP is better than what everybody expected. Even the policymakers. So it's not even surprising just the detractors. It is surprising even the people in the government and in RBI. And that's been happening. In the last set of data that came out at end of August, which was for the first quarter of this financial year, which is April, May and June. So for those 3 months, again, India's real GDP grew by 7.8%. Now, this is a fantastic number because the rest of the world or comparable economies are struggling to grow even at 1 or 2%. Many are actually fighting contraction. So India's economy growing at 7.8% is fantastic news.
Yeah, I know that. Why is that a surprise? Why does that surprise you? I mean, why can't India do so well?
Yeah. So this is the most interesting thing, that if you for a moment stop looking at just the GDP data, real GDP numbers, and focus on what's happening on the policy space, then the noise is very different. There you will find that, look at the last 1 month. It's all been about the Prime Minister down everybody saying it is a Bachat Utsav. We have cut GST rates. We have given relief. Consumers can now consume, consumption levels may go up. And you just look back a few months, you will find that a similar story was happening when the budget was announced. Right? And the income tax relief was given. And if you go back a couple of years, you'll again see, the income tax relief was given to 7 lakh per annum. Then it was raised to 12 lakh per annum. And in between, look at all the election news. All our elections are now filled by news of economic doles, both the party in power and the party trying to dethrone, regardless of which the party is. All parties are trying to give some economic dole or the other, which the Prime Minister calls reveries. So the news coming out of those stories, policy space, is all about, okay, people must be going through a really tough phase, right? And the economy needs some kind of a boost or a booster dose, some kind of a relief. Whereas the GDP data all the time is showing very promising picture. In fact, over-promising in some senses because it's surprising on the upside almost every time. And that's the odd thing.
So wait, you're saying that if people are doing well, if they are in fact Atmanirbhar, then why is the government going out of its way to help them? Because the logic one imagines is that if the economy is doing well, then people are doing well. They should have money to spend. They should not require relief packages from the government.
Yes, I mean, there is a very simple logic that if the economy is doing very well, the government doesn't have to do much, right? It can just, take its share of taxes and carry on. But when the economy struggles, and when we say economy struggles, we basically are saying that, people do not have enough money to spend. They are not doing so well in terms of income. That is when the government really comes into play. They figure out policies, either giving tax breaks or spending more for the poor people, so both in terms of expenditure and tax policy, government tries to figure out to solve a way to boost the economy. So here is this odd situation, which I say the curious case, that on the one hand, the economy is doing very well, but on the other, government is trying to solve it when perhaps there is no problem, as it were.
And couldn't it be that the GDP is doing well because of these measures by the government, as in it gave more money into the hands of people, boosted demand, so people are buying more, and that's how the economy is growing?
That is entirely possible that one could argue that it is because what the government is doing that the economy is doing so well. But again, it's in the relative measure. You look at it, how it's happening. We are coming out of a phase of high inflation. So typically, when there's a high inflation phase, you would not be doing that. A high inflation phase essentially means that economy is doing well, because there's a lot of demand, relative to supply. The supply is not able to provide for all the demand. That is high inflation. So in such a scenario, even when we had high inflation or higher than desired inflation till last year, because the low inflation story has just started this year, the government was still doing the same thing. And the funny part is this, even after all of that, even after the GDP data is good and the government is doing all of this, the question still remains, why aren't companies investing? And the finance minister, who's known to ask this question, why isn't Hanuman flying? She's still asking the same question again. And they're still wanting that to happen. And, we've had these podcast conversations now for a while. Since 2019, this question has been there, that the consumption in India is weak. And we need to figure out a way to boost consumption. This is the closing on 2025, and we have tried all policy measures and consumption is still weak, while the GDP data is very rosy. So somewhere there is some gap.
Okay, so basically if we look at the real GDP numbers, something seems off, because this is very contradictory to what policymakers are doing. So if not the real GDP, what should we be looking at to get a better sense of the economy?
Right. So, I repeatedly say that real GDP is the right number to look at for economic growth. And we've written many pieces about this, that many people have questioned, even people like former Chief Economic Advisor of India have questioned that India's GDP data is overstating India's growth. And some have actually looked at, how do you take away the effect of inflation? That exact formula can be misleading. So at a time when inflation for you and me might be 4 or 5%, if you reduce only 1% from inflation, then even a 8% nominal GDP can give you 7% real GDP growth. And somebody might say, but if you are only reducing 1, obviously this will happen. If you were to reduce something like 4% inflation out of this, then the growth may fall to 4%. That's roughly the calculation. Now, that is where people are beginning to ask, is there a better way to look at India's GDP? And what I did in this recent piece was to look at nominal GDP. This is the observed value, right? There is no discrepancy, as it were, on the face of it, on the observed value, because that's the fact on the ground. So let's look at what is the observed value and see what is happening. And that is where I find that many of the notions that we have that we are doing very well start to break down.
Yeah, and elaborate on that. Tell us, what kind of a picture does looking at nominal GDP give us? What is it telling us that the real GDP numbers aren't?
Yeah, so one thing to look at is that if you just look at the breakup of where does growth come from? So when you talk about GDP is basically a collection of all the expenditures that happen in an economy. Now, the biggest expenditure or biggest engine of growth for the GDP of our country is the private consumption. Like all the money that you and I spend in our personal capacities. You buy a bar of chocolate, I buy a personal computer, all of that goes into private personal consumption. And that aggregated, that demand is the personal consumption of the private demand in the country. And that accounts for roughly, 55 to 60% of total GDP of the country. And the second biggest engine, as it were, is the expenditure that people or businesses make towards investments in the economy. You have private sector firms starting a new business or laying down a new factory, governments building a new road. So all the expenditure that goes for that. So that's the second big engine of growth.
Right. And what does the data reveal about these two things, about these two important factors?
Now, the data shows that India's GDP, if you look at it, nominal GDP, it grew by 8.8% in the first quarter. But, and here is the rub, the two biggest engines of growth, which is the private consumption and the expenditure towards investments, which together roughly account for 90% of India's GDP, those two engines grew at less than 8.8%, means they were basically dragging down the overall GDP. So what was pulling up the GDP? It was government's own expenditure. What money government spends on its day-to-day functioning, not for investments, right? Not the money that people spend on their own, not the money that private businesses spend towards fresh investment. What is pulling up the economy is government's own expenditure, daily expenditure. So that begs the question that if you were to take away that fast growth of the government, then overall GDP, nominal GDP would be coming down. There is one more way to look at nominal GDP. Nominal GDP gives the ceiling for the country's total growth, because typically in a country like India, there will always be an inflation. And back of the envelope calculation always has been that you grow at 12% nominal GDP, you have something like 4% inflation in the country, you remove that and you get 8% GDP growth, real GDP growth. Now, if you are growing in nominal terms at only 8% or 9%, and the inflation that you and I face is typically 4 or 5%, then it starts to, make sense that maybe in real terms, we are not growing as fast as the formal numbers are showing, and that may have something to do with how you deflate, how you take away the inflation from nominal. But those are all technical matters. For what matters for us as consumers is that this is not fitting in with our lived reality. The real GDP numbers and the rosy real GDP numbers are not somehow fitting in with our lived everyday reality. And that's why everybody is now looking for different ways to understand what is happening in the economy. And the biggest proof in this is that policymakers seem to be knowing that there is weakness. Otherwise, every passing year, the policymakers, either in election or in budgets, are finding ways to cut taxes, provide some kind of relief, right? And make a lot of song and dance about it. But it's a tacit admission that even they know that the economy is not as strong in real terms as the numbers may suggest. So they may defend it publicly, but somewhere the reality is not matching up.
I mean, obviously, it's concerning that India's economy is not doing as well as these numbers might reflect. But also, what concerns does it raise when everyone is looking at a number that instead of telling us the reality is painting a rosier picture?
So this is again one topic that we've visited in the past, that data is a very salient bit in policy making. And many of the listeners might also recall similar episodes happening elsewhere in the world. US President Donald Trump recently fired the head of Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the data, or he had genuine concerns about labor data not being good. But the question of data and statistics and their sanctity is central to what is happening in India. We have in the past shown how many times the government itself has dragged down or played down its own official surveys because it didn't perhaps like that data and said that this data was not of good quality. We didn't have a census at the right time, and that even if you do a census now, it will upset the whole comparison cycle. So we have several glaring issues, and can become a full podcast in itself of what all we need to do to set right that data issue. But if you do not have updated or correct statistics, your policy making can go totally awry. And it can start by asking, you have to start by looking at each and every data point. Do we have the right inflation data? When we say we have inflation of 4%, then do we have the actual right number? Because without that, the GDP number may be affected. So it just starts to, have all kinds of ramifications if your building blocks of data are not of the best quality. And that's data quality has been a massive issue in India almost now since 2011-12 when we started shifting away because we abandoned a lot of pre-existing surveys. So yeah, that concern carries on and it will have impact on policy making.
And next we talk about a case that at first seemed like a series of unrelated family tragedies, but has now been uncovered as part of a major insurance scam. It began as something that looked like a personal calamity. 3 deaths in one family over just 7 years, and each attributed to either an accident or a sudden illness. But when investigators in Uttar Pradesh began joining the dots, they uncovered something far darker. A calculated web of deceit and manipulation that had gone undetected for years.
So, in January this year, the Sambal police had uncovered this insurance mafia that was getting young men insured under multiple policies. And then mysteriously these young men were dying. And in return, there were people who were benefiting out of these deaths through the insurance payouts.
This is the Indian Express's Saman Hussian, who reported on the story for the paper.
So after this, they started a statewide crackdown of insurance scams. For that, they had reached out to insurance companies. They had sent them notices asking them to send data on deaths which occurred just a year after the policy was bought. So in the list of names, the insurance company had specifically said that Vishal Singhal, this man's case is very interesting and that they should look deeper into it. So that is when his name had been highlighted to the police.
Saman tells us that Vishal has now been arrested by the Sambal police for allegedly murdering his parents and his first wife to claim their life insurance money.
So Vishal was basically this man in his late 30s who was absolutely unemployed. He had a double-story house, a modest one, not a very fancy one, in this area that's close to the cantonment in Meerut. And there, the neighbors say that he used to mostly not talk to anyone. And even they preferred not to talk to him because he used to always get into fights. There were brides that were mysteriously coming and then leaving him within a fraction of days. Lot of neighborhood fights also he used to get into. And they say that his background was such that he used to once, back when they used to live in a village in Hapur, this was before they moved to Meerut, he used to scrub dishes at a halwai's shop. And he used to serve tea at a tea stall. So the sudden wealth is something that was very confusing for a lot of people who had seen him gain over the years.
And so it turns out that between 2017 and 2024, Singhal's mother, father, and his first wife died in quick succession.
So basically, after his father's case was highlighted by the insurance companies, they started retracing Vishal's past. So his mother, Prabha Devi, who had died in 2017, she had reportedly been hit by an unknown vehicle. Then his father, Mukesh Chand, who had died in 2024, also hit by an unknown vehicle. And in each of these cases, Vishal would somehow just survive with minor injuries. So back then in 2017 as well as in April 2024 when his father had died, FIRs had been lodged. But the issue was that there was nothing found in the case. This was the Hapur police and these cases were closed with final reports. later, it turned out that this was under a whole insurance mafia, because when they retraced the amount of money that he would get each time somebody from his family would die, that made the whole case look suspicious. And also the amount of insurances that he was buying right before the person's death. So on top of that, there were other red flags as well, that he had bought some 4 cars. All of these cars were bought just a month before his father's death. So the question was that a person who was basically unemployed, how was he planning to repay the loan on these 4 cars? Because these cars were bought in his father's name, and he had taken a loan in his father's name to buy these cars. The loan amount on all of these cars was cleared by the insurance companies, and soon after he ended up selling 3 of those cars. So other than the cars, he had bought a lot of stuff in his father's name right before his death. So this whole thing made it look very, very suspicious for the police. They also said that back in April 2024, when his father was admitted at a hospital after his accident, there was an insurance company that had visited for a field visit because Vishal had been claiming the payouts. So they saw that his father was lying on a hospital bed and that he did not even have a single scratch on his body, the picture of which the insurance company has shared with the police. So this was another red flag that made it look like these deaths were all planned and that they were not accidents.
In fact, what shocked investigators was the scale of his operation. For example, his father Mukesh Singhal was insured under 64 different life insurance policies worth nearly 50 crore rupees, all naming Vishal as the sole nominee.
So his father's case is the one that had initially got the investigators' attention first. But if you will look, it was a whole trail of policies. So before that, it had started with his mother. So the initial policy that he had gotten under his mother's name, it was not an expensive policy at all. It was, in fact, one of those government subsidized policies that you get. So the payout was not much. But then he eventually started using this money to buy more policies in future. So then later he bought policies for his wife, which were worth much more. The wife was also disabled. So she had policies in her name from before marriage as well. From that money later, he started buying policies in his father's name. So this is what the investigators are assuming. But other than that, it's uncertain as to how he was able to manage 64 policies in total, and that too in one person's name.
Now, the turning point in this case came earlier this year, when Vishal's 4th wife, Shreya, escaped his house barefoot with her child, shouting for help.
So in between, he had 2 to 3 other wives that the police and investigators are still not able to get more information about, because these women would get married to him and then they would eventually leave within just a fraction of days. All of them scared, as the neighbors used to say. So all of these women are basically from somehow marginalized or somehow disadvantaged. So there is also a marriage broker who used to help Vishal set up these marriages, who's on the lookout by the police. Some of these wives were basically factory workers. So this is all that's known about them. Now, by the time Shreya came, Shreya told me that in the very beginning of their marriage itself, he told her that he will have to kill his father. So that is something that really alarmed her. He also told her that he has done something similar. In a similar manner, he has killed other people in his family in the past. And that now it's his father's turn, because he's bought a lot of things in his name. And now to clear the loan on those things that he's bought, which included 4 cars, all Apple products possible, like a MacBook, 2 iPhones, EarPods, all of those things. To clear the loan, he needs to kill his father now. So she told me that she said that I will not let this happen. But he was like, if I'll not kill my father, then I'll have to kill you. So she told me that she had to fight quite a lot at her home to convince them that she needs to return and that this man is dangerous. But eventually she was able to convince her family that Vishal is up to something. This was after he killed his father. But once Shreya left, she approached multiple authorities. She wrote to the district police authorities who took no action in the case. Then she highlighted that no action is being taken despite the complaints to the CMO office. Once again, nothing came out of it. But then when she approached the insurance companies, they were the ones who helped the police reach Shreya. So in turn, this is how she was able to eventually help the probe.
For investigators who were already probing a large-scale insurance fraud network, what UP Police says is the insurance mafia, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Now, someone tells us that this network allegedly involved agents, hospital staff, and beneficiaries who would take out multiple insurance policies in the names of family members and then stage their deaths to claim payouts.
So in Sambal Police's crackdown, that has been a crackdown that was across the state. The scam that has been uncovered so far has reached around 100 crores. So it's quite big. And the police was saying that most of these cases are around the northern states of India. So Uttar Pradesh is one state where a lot of insurance scams have been uncovered. So this includes areas like Shamli, Hapur, Amroha. Then on top of that, there are certain cases that they've been able to solve in other states as well, like Himachal and Uttarakhand. So it's quite big. It's something that's become very common, the police had told me.
And in the end, we talk about peace. After months of conflict, headlines from the Middle East are finally using the word peace. But at the Gaza Peace Summit in Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh, where hostages and detainees are being exchanged, optimism is mixed with deep skepticism. As reported by the Indian Express's Anil Sasi, the truce brokered by the United States and declared by President Donald Trump is only the first step in his 20-point peace plan for the region. Under the agreement, Israel released about 2,000 Palestinian detainees, while Hamas freed 20 surviving Israeli hostages and handed over 28 bodies to the Red Cross. However, declaring this as the end of the war in Gaza may be the easy part. What comes next is far more complicated because there is still no clarity on Gaza's post-war administration or reconstruction. Sasi highlights that the next stages of Trump's plan involve disarming Hamas, security guarantees for Gaza, rebuilding the enclave on a large scale, and the rehabilitation of displaced residents. But the plan is vague about Palestinian statehood and offers no clear commitment to it. Experts noted that summit's optics may outweigh its substance, as the participating leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, lack a unified post-conflict vision. Palestinians were not directly involved in the negotiations and were not represented at the table, raising concerns about the legitimacy and sustainability of the agreement. Jonathan Conricus, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense and Democracies and a former Israel Defense Forces spokesperson, said the truce would remain a temporary ceasefire if Hamas refused to disarm. Nader Hashmi, director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, said the fundamental issue of Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories had not been addressed. Sasi further reports that Netanyahu, facing domestic political and legal challenges, may also have little incentive to sustain the peace effort. Analysts suggest that either leader could later claim that Hamas violated the agreement to justify abandoning the deal. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.